Hello, welcome to the PiG Daily. Today it's episode number 93 where we talk about very important things, namely patch 3.8 and how much Blizzard screwed it up and are trying to ruin our lives as people that play StarCraft. Obviously that's not what I'm talking about. I'm here to talk about StarCraft, guys, but we're going to talk about the patch changes and the most recent community feedback, and I will talk about some things where I think maybe the balance changes aren't in the right direction, and also some other ones where I'm just like, this could lead to this being a big problem. I'm not someone who likes to necessarily come out and just say, this will just absolutely be broken, or this will be good, or this will be bad, unless I really 100% feel that way. A good example is the Infestor in Wings of Liberty. Back when I was, a nobody in the scene, I remember looking at the Infestor in like 2011 at the very start of the year and being like, you know what? I think this unit's just like friggin' broken. Because I was like, wait. So like it doesn't even need to get an upgrade and it can burrow move. You just need burrow. I'm like, well, that's pretty friggin' crazy. Like it has permanent cloak effectively. That's amazing. And it can drop infested Terrans out of that. Okay, cool. And infested Terrans are basically 3/3 Marines. Like, they get the same upgrades as your unit. So, okay. So you, with a 2 supply unit that is permanently cloaked, can unload an entire medevac of Marines for only energy. Yeah, something seems a little bit good. Okay. Oh, also you have Neural Parasite, which is like, it's pretty niche, but yeah, you can actually land that and get some good spells. Oh, and you've got this like sick fungal growth spell, which just like used to not be a projectile. It used to like instantly lock down units and screw them over. And I just looked at this unit and I was like, you know what? It has like 2 really mainstream abilities, which are just fantastic in frontal engagements, as well as harassment. And then it's got this really niche ability, which has the potential to turn a fight around as well. And I immediately was just like, nah, I think this is just too good. Like this unit, if you look at RTS classically, there's usually like one kind of direct combat ability on a spellcaster, and then everything else is like super niche. Like High Templar is like, I've got feedback. I can mess up energy units, but otherwise I don't really do anything. And I can morph into an Archon, which after a delay will turn me into a pretty decent fighting unit. And you're like, yeah, okay, that's cool, right? But the Infestor, I felt like had a big problem. Obviously, it turned into being a very big problem. It got nerfed really hard at the end of Wings of Liberty, after like a year of people just making Infestors and Broodlords and winning games like that. So I think it was, there are some things which are just, this is broken, this is unfair, all that sort of shit. So anyway, let's start talking through these changes. I'm going to give you guys my opinion. First of all, let's talk about the Cyclone. So Blizzard came out and they were like, let's take a look actually. Okay, so this is their most recent community feedback update from December 2nd. And they said, okay, so Cyclone range upgrade. They said, look, pro players are pointing out they were actually already able to deal with Cyclone all-ins towards the end of the testing phase. So we're going to just kind of revert it. We're going to get rid of the range upgrade and just give Cyclone 6 range from when they start out. And that's okay. I'm kind of okay with this change. I want to say that the Cyclone, yeah, it's kind of derpy and shit in some ways. So giving it that 2 range makes it a bit more threatening, because it already has too many weaknesses. So you can't have the short range as well as those weaknesses. That's something I'll talk about in just a moment. The scary thing with giving it this range is like all-ins. Cyclone Hellbat, Cyclone Hellion. For people in the lower end of ladder especially, trying to adjust to this might take a little bit of time. I would just say keep your eyes out, guys, on remembering the weaknesses of the Cyclone. So if you want to stop all-ins from Cyclones, it's just thinking about 2 things. One, it sucks against armor. Not armored, the class, but the fact that it does 3 or 5 damage a shot means every single point of armor you have just destroys it. So, for instance, if you're using Queens, they've got 1 base armor, and they're not armored units, which means it does 3 damage a shot, -1, it does 2 damage a shot. It's like, it's pretty shit. So that's the problem with the Cyclone at the moment, is like, it does almost double the damage to armored units, and then it does like almost half to light units. And it's like, okay, well, already you've got this unit which does way better versus armored units and not that well versus light units. But then you add on top of that, it's like, oh, and by the way, if you've got like an armor upgrade or you've got like a base point of armor on that unit, it totally destroys my damage output as well. And you're like, whoa, okay. So you get the Cyclone where I really like the idea of this Cyclone, by the way. I like it as like an A-movie fucking unit. You just kind of, it does well as like a meaty thing that sits in front of Mech. But I feel like there's a few too many weaknesses with it at the moment, where it's like, think about it, you're fighting against Protoss, and it's like, well, if you're hitting the Stalkers, you're going to shred them. Yeah, even with that point of armor, you know, they're armored units, you're going to do sick damage. But how often are you actually able to shoot on the Stalkers? I guess now with the range upgrade, with good focus fire, you might be able to just focus the Stalkers over the Zealots and Adepts or whatever it is that's in front. And that can do okay. However, even then, with pullback micro, it's still a little bit hard to actually focus those units down. So I definitely feel like the Cyclone already starts losing its identity as this like roach type A-movie unit, which just kind of like, you know, it's meant to be kind of easy to use, but I feel like it's so specialized in its current role and that it only really performs versus armored units. And as a result, it doesn't really work out that well. So if you think about it, a lot of players are like, well, the reason Blizzard have done this is because they don't want it to overlap. The Hellion kills light units, the Cyclone kills armored units. You can't have the Cyclone just do both job, or why would you ever build Hellions? And maybe that's where the problem stems from. Maybe there's just too many units on the factory right now. There's tanks, Thors, Cyclones, and Hellions of course can become Hellbats as well. And the problem the Cyclone has right now is it costs 100 gas. It costs almost as much gas as a siege tank, which is 125. And yet it doesn't perform as well versus armored units. And it doesn't perform as well versus light units as the Hellions either. It's this unit which you can pump out very quickly and very suddenly, and it's very tanky. It's almost as tanky as a Thor, but it's not as tanky as Hellbats. So, okay, well, it's not as good as tanking for your siege tanks as Hellbats. It's not as good at doing damage to armored units as just having more tanks. It's not good against light units as Hellions. So the Cyclone at the moment, I feel like it does have a few too many weaknesses, and I kind of wish Blizzard would just make the Cyclone into this unit where it just like has a flat damage output of 4 or something like that, somewhere in between. Like at the moment it does 3 damage to light, 5 to armored. Why not just make it 4 damage flat and just make it generically decent against everything? Leave the other units in their specialized roles and make this the Roach of Terran. Make the Cyclone this unit which you can just A-move about, have a bunch of them clumped up in your army in front, and they're going to do okay versus everything. They're not going to do as well as Hellions would against light units. They're not going to do as well as more tanks would do against armored units. But why can't Terran just have a unit which just kind of performs like the Roach? I don't know. I feel like people are saying... And there's this crazy part of Reddit right now who are saying, oh, you know what? The Cyclone isn't microable. It's a boring unit. And there's this big vocal part of the community saying this. And I'm just there. I'm like, are you guys mad? You guys play Terran. Terran is the race which has way too much shit to do already. Like, Terran mechanically is the hardest race. It absolutely is. Terran does have the ability to put that pressure onto their opponents and force them to also play very mechanically, difficult dealing to the pressure. But the fact remains that Terran armies don't perform on their own. If you're not looking at your bio ball, it fucking just disappears. If you're looking at your if you're not looking at your Roach Hydra, it's still going to do its job generally well. If you're not looking at a Colossus army, it's going to do its job decently well. An Immortal Chargelet army is going to do its job decently well. But Bio already and Terran in general really suffers from this issue where if you're not looking at the right engagement at the right time, your shit just falls apart. And I really like the idea of the Cyclone is we're going to change into this meaty kind of chunky unit. You just throw it into your army and it just kind of fucking buffs everything out and kind of does its job no matter what. And you can focus on harassing or macro, not look at your army, and it's still going to give a decent account of itself. And I think that's something which Terran has been lacking, to quite a big extent. So personally, I think the Cyclone would be better if it was just a bit more flat with its damage output. I know Nathanias in his video responding to this community feedback was saying double its damage output so it can actually kill something. I think that would make it just ridiculous versus armored units. But I agree with the same sentiment there. Is that like it just doesn't do enough to things like Adepts and Zealots because it's so unmicroable and kind of meaty. Of course, maybe if you make it too well-rounded, it's just too good a unit overall. But I still think that what a lot of people aren't taking into account when they think that, if we do this, the Cyclone will be too strong, is it's an expensive unit. You can build it out of a reactor, but it costs 100 gas each. If you start pumping out Cyclones 2 at a time at the start of a game, you literally can't build anything else. You don't have the economy. So I think the Cyclone's in a very interesting spot right now. I'd love it to be a bit more A-movie, a bit more generically just applicable to more situations. At the moment, because it's got this whole I only do half the damage to light units identity, and oh, by the way, I also get completely screwed up if I'm attacking like a light unit that has a single armor point. It just kind of ends up in these situations where it just loses effectiveness so drastically that I don't think the Cyclone has enough of a space right now. Of course, guys, the other big thing to consider with the Cyclone, and this is really the problem right now, which I think Terran's facing, is in TVP, they've lost... actually, I think it was Nathanius who said it. He's like, oh, the Cyclone was the mothership core of Terran. It was just this one unit which could shut down everything. And I'm like, that's a really good way of putting it, because the Cyclone could lock onto oracles. It could blast them out of the sky. It could just knock out, it could destroy a pylon rush completely on its own using its lock on. The Cyclone was just this fantastic unit, which really made it much scarier for Protoss players to commit to things like oracle pressure. It allowed the Terran to catch enemy units on the map in the early game and just kind of shut them down if they were exposed, as well as perform some scary attacks. Because that's been lost, I do feel like the kind of number of openings for Terran, the range there has been limited. And I think that's something which is very frightening, because I already felt like Protoss had a lot more build diversity. And I'm talking pro level here, guys. I'm talking high level play. Might not be the same, you might not feel the same in Gold League or wherever. But at pro level, I feel like Protoss had a lot more build diversity in the PvT matchup. I felt like Terran was... there was a lot of all-ins coming out at top-level pro play. A lot of like crazy just proxies and 1-1-1s. We saw Beyondbeat stats with just a whole bunch of proxy builds. And I really do think that kind of spoke to like, how can I surprise my opponent? It's not, oh, I'm going to pull out my 5 different, macro builds, because you've only got 1 or 2 macro builds that are solid. It's, I'm going to proxy the shit out of my opponent and do it that way. So I definitely think the Cyclone being lost from Terran might be a bit of an issue there. But I definitely think that's something where I kind of wish that could be solved in a different way, rather than just saying, let's just get the old Cyclone back in as this niche unit which shuts everything down in the early game. I really wish there was like some other way we could make Terran have a little bit more protection against things like all the things that cause them problems in early game. Warp Prisms, DTs, Blink attacks, mainly the Warp Prism. The Warp Prism is probably the main one there. So maybe there's another way to approach that problem. Anyway, guys, that's enough talking about the Cyclone, because I blabbered about that one. That's a unit I have a lot of feelings about. I've got so many feelings. And I wanted to talk about that. So next one, Hydra. Let's talk about the Hydralisk and range. Now, I'm not just focusing on the community feedback, by the way, but I guess that does bring us to the next point. If we're going to talk about the Hydra, we might as well talk about the next point in the community feedback, which is, let's give the Colossus a bunch of light damage. So +4 to light. Now, keep in mind, that's 2 12 damage attacks the Colossus has at the moment. Seems pretty shitty, doesn't it? The Colossus did get its damage nerf down from 15 a shot in Heart of the Swarm to 12. So that's going to boost that up quite a lot. A lot of people have been very anti this. I'm someone who's still on the fence in terms of like, okay, plus light damage. Against Zerg, I think that might actually be completely okay. Make the Colossus a bit more viable. The problem is Colossus are already pretty fantastic against Terran. A lot of Protoss players right now are mixing in 2 to 3 Colossi to force Vikings out of Terran. And then they're just building a couple Disruptors, taking up to Storm. And even if the Colossi go down, the Disruptors combined with their ground army and force fields is enough to hold back the Terran. And then they get Storm out as well. And the Terran kind of ends up feeling like they're constantly kind of behind on exactly which units they need out at what time. So I think if you add that light damage, Marines are just going to disappear, and that could be a little bit problematic. So Colossus light damage is definitely something where I feel like it's aimed at PvZ right now, and that's why we should really talk about the Hydralisk. So the Hydralisk, it's gotten an extra range upgrade, where it gets +2 range rather than +1 from its Grooved Spines upgrade. Now remember, for anyone who hasn't played in a while, in Heart of the Swarm, the Legacy of the Void, last year, the upgrades on the Hydralisk were consolidated. So movement speed and range went into one upgrade, quite affordable, would upgrade pretty quickly, and bam, your Hydras are running around off creep at a good speed, no movement speed boost on creep, and they would shoot 1 range further. And really, we saw what? Hydraling Lurker for a lot of time in the early days of Legacy, but very soon we realized that there was a lot of very binary games. Ling Hydra Lurker would push across the map, it would set up at the Protoss base, and the Zerg would be like, I need to fucking push in right now, because there'd be this moment where the Protoss would get like 10 Immortals, and the Protoss would like just spread his units, move through the Lurker Hydraling, and every immortal would be alive at the end of the fight. The immortals would all regenerate their shields. The Zerg would just have nothing left. He'd be like, trying to attack with Hydralurkerling again. The immortal charge ult was just too efficient once it built up to a certain size. So the Lurker Hydraling at pro level kind of built up as this pro style where it was a timing attack. It was you attack with your Ling Hydralurker, you hit that one moment, and you really try to fuck up the Protoss, deny his fourth base, and then, you've got a fifth behind it, and you're far enough ahead, you can play it out even with a slightly less efficient army. The one time where it wasn't played just as one clear, I'm just going to hit the front timing, is when you see players like Nurture, who on certain maps and certain positions would focus more on drops and multi-prong, and he'd be able to play it out to a bit later in the game than most other pro players were. And he's one of the few players who actually kept doing Ling Hydralurker, even right up until a few weeks ago at the end of 3.7. So Ling Hydralurker was already a pretty strong style, but it was much more niche, really was only Nurture and occasionally a laser that was still using it. Now, suddenly, the Hydralisk gets one more range, and that's massive. But it kicks in later. That movement speed upgrade is now separated from the range upgrade. And what this effect does is it extends the mid game. And this is something I really like. So I love the idea behind the Hydra range upgrade. I'm gonna talk about why I think it's too strong in a moment. But for now, I love the idea of let's make the Hydra not hit its strength as early in the game. You've got to get 2 upgrades. So rather than just getting 1 upgrade and then being able to attack with these super mobile Hydras with the extra range, now you're like, well, I can either get the movement speed or I can get the range. And the movement speed upgrade, it gives you more help defensively now because you can move faster on creep as well, which is cool. That's great. But you can't just get them both at the same time unless you go double Hydroden, which is a much bigger investment. So it basically takes away from the power of the initial timing attack. And the trade-off there is that then Hydras, though, they get an extra range eventually, and so then they can survive later into the mid-game. Rather than Protoss saying, hey, I've got 10 Immortals and some Archons, I'm just going to roll you, the Hydras with that extra range can put up a much better fight against that now, especially with the movement speed on creep. If you're then transitioning into Broodlords or some higher tech and the Protoss is doing the counter-attack, it used to be the situation where the Protoss player would just like roll over you and the Hydras and Lurkers were getting wrecked. But now with that movement speed, those Hydras are going to be able to kite so well on creep. Those Hydralisks with their range are going to be so good at defending. And this kind of entices Zerg players to invest more in a mid game without just going all in on one attack. That's amazing. That's fantastic. So I think the idea behind the Hydra changes, amazing ideas, but maybe a little bit too powerful. And that brings me to that point where right now the Hydralisk, it outranges planetary fortresses. It outranges Immortals, Stalkers, Sentries. Nate did his little bit in his video talking about it. It outranges Marine and Marauder as well. But because of siege tanks and the fast kind of moving nature of Marine Marauder, it's not as much of a problem there. We want to focus on ZVP when we talk about the Hydra for now. It outranges all those Protoss units. And because it's got so much range as well, even High Templar and Disruptors, when they come forward to fight Hydralisk-based styles now, really struggle to not get sniped off when they're exposed at the front. So it really does just increase the overall strength of Hydralisks a crazy amount. Like, I feel like it's... The problem here isn't, hey, we've made the Hydralisk last stronger into the mid-game. Like I said, I like that. What I think the problem is the way the Hydralisk works. So just to think about the stats of the Hydralisk is basically a permanently stimmed Marine. Like, it attacks as fast as its Marine, it does roughly double the damage, it has more hit points by just a little bit, and, it's Zerg, so you can build 1 billion of them at once without building upgrades like Stim, reactors, and tech labs, and all these sort of things. The issue with the Hydralisk is that because it's fragile, it's only got 80 hit points, and yet it costs 100 minerals and 50 gas, to splash damage or to any sort of high damage units that can close with it quickly, it can just disappear very quickly, which is why we classically saw roaches in front of Hydralisks. We saw these kind of compositions where we always tried to have some buffer for the Hydras. The problem now is if you give the Hydralisk an extra range, you've already got it as this super high damage output unit, which is very fragile. And then you've said, well, you're still just as fragile, but I'm making you even more high damage by letting you shoot further. So you're turning a glass cannon into an even glassier cannon, or an even bigger cannon. It's the same amount of glass, I guess. The problem there is that the Hydralisk still is going to be very one-sided in how it engages a lot of the time. It's either the enemy are going to close with it and kill them really quickly before they can get the damage output, and they're all just going to disappear to some good storms or charge lots diving on top of them or something like that. Or they're just going to gun down all the enemy units before they manage to assume a position. So the problem with this is if we think about that classic Hydra Lurker Zergling sort of push that I've been talking about, I was saying the problem is it would come in, the Protoss would just, the Zerg would just try to hit before there was enough units up to counter it, and they would usually either roll the Protoss army pretty hard or they'd just get completely wrecked. And it was very one-sided, the battles, a lot of the time. And I feel like with the new Hydra upgrade, it's just going to entice more of that same play, where it's like, well, either the Protoss has like 15 oracles that he surprises the Hydras with and comes out and zaps them, or he has enough charge ults and a flank and just overwhelms them while the Lurkers are setting up, or he just gets completely wrecked. And that's a big problem. I don't think that's going to create interesting gameplay. I actually love Nathaniel's suggestion of why not add a few more hit points on the Hydralisk to encourage it kind of lasting in the mid game a bit more. But don't make it outrange everything like this. It makes it so hard for someone to engage against it. And it also makes it very hard to poke back and forwards. There's often a lot of cool micro with current Hydra-based pushes against Protoss, where the Protoss edges in and out, and he's using force fields, and the two armies zone against each other. And, you know, I move forward and try to snipe some units, you move forward and try to zone some units without ever exposing yourself to a bad position. Against the current Hydralisks, you simply can't do that. You'll lose out the trade every time. Until you get Disruptors out, you can't engage them at range. Even when you have Storm, it's very difficult to land those Storms if they're spread at all. So it becomes a situation where Protoss is often looking for one decisive engagement against Zerg. And I feel like that encourages boring engagements, one-sided engagements, which are going to be over very quickly. So I think the Hydralisk being buffed is fantastic. I think they've slowed down. So what the design team's done is they slowed down the power spike of the Hydra because those upgrades are split, which is fantastic because it says, let's take away from the power of this as an aggressive timing attack unit, but let's give it more strength into the mid game. Good, sound reasoning, but I don't think the right change. I think the Hydra range is a little bit too strong. Add some hit points or something like that instead, and it's going to be a lot more well-rounded. All right. So that's the Hydralisk and the Cyclone. I think those are the two units which I have the most to talk about. Obviously, there's a lot more to talk about as well, and I will go through a few more units. Just on a personal note, I think it's interesting to see how well siege tanks do with bio against Ling Bane over the coming weeks. Because if Terrans don't really have an option to go Widow Mines or anything like that anymore against Zerg, in my opinion, because of the Hydra. I feel like Terran is forced to go siege tanks against a Ling Bane comp. Because if the Zerg just adds like 12 Hydralisks in with range, that's always going to outrange the bio. So any sort of pre-spread setup, which is what Terran classically needs against Ling Bane, is just going to constantly get harassed by Hydralisks coming in and just poking the edge of the bio. And the bio is going to need to kind of group up and kind of try to engage into the Hydras. And each time they do that, Banelings can come forward and kind of chase the bio back. So I think the range advantage of siege tanks is pretty much completely necessary with this change as well because of that Hydra range buff. So whether that comes into play, we're going to find out down the track. That's going to be interesting. For now, let's talk about the carrier, guys. The carrier. Okay, the carrier. What the fuck is the carrier doing right now? Why the hell do the interceptors not cost money? What is going on? A lot of people are freaking out right now. Let's take a look here. And my thoughts basically completely align with Snoot's. I think he had a fantastic comment. You guys may have seen this linked on Reddit. This was in the Team Liquid thread here. So this is the paragraph here specifically. Essentially, guys, right now interceptors cost only 5 minerals, down from 25 minerals an interceptor. So they're almost free. So Protoss can engage, lose all the interceptors, run away, rebuild the interceptors, and then engage again, and it's almost free. As long as they don't lose the carriers, they can just keep on fighting over and over again. It's really frustrating and a bit silly to play against. I really like what Snoot says. He says carrier strength is too binary. Couldn't agree with you more there, Snoot. Good analysis. So what he actually says is I would bring the interceptor cost up to 10 at least. At the moment, it trades too well at max, and killing interceptors isn't even an option now. Only to win by the no interceptors left push forward condition. So what he's saying is the only way you can win is by sniping down every interceptor and then diving on top of the carriers before they can rebuild the interceptors, because you haven't actually achieved anything by killing the interceptors until you kill the carriers themselves. And it's very frustrating because usually the carriers escape before you can do that. So he says the carrier should actually spawn with 8 interceptors rather than 4. He says, you know, they're too weak initially. When they first pop out, they're really easy to beat. You've already spent a century building the thing. It should spawn with 8 interceptors. Why are we making it take so long to get up? He also says Graviton Catapult upgrade should just be removed. They should just make the interceptors fire somewhere between before and after upgrades. So he's saying they should actually nerf the rate at which the interceptors launch at. That's something I'd never thought of myself. But I think, yeah, well, definitely removing the upgrades is a good idea as well, because if you want to make this unit a bit more kind of malleable and flexible and something which kind of creates back and forth engagements and so on, you do want to have these interceptors go a little bit you want them to just to kind of get into play a bit earlier and just be a unit which scales a bit more evenly. Whereas at the moment, your first 3 carriers, it's like, cool, I got 3 carriers, here's 20 hydras, oh, the interceptors died, I can't fucking do anything, and they all just die. But then you hit this point where like Graviton Catapult kicks in, you hit like 5 or 6 carriers, and suddenly there's too many interceptors swarming in, and the power of the army just, it goes up exponentially. It becomes so much stronger. So I like here that Snoot says, well, why not make the carriers pop out sooner? Make them pop out faster, or at least pop out with interceptors already. Cut this upgrade. Make it so they start off with the upgrade. Maybe nerf the upgrade a little bit. You know, at the moment, the carriers are just a bit too binary. And I think that's the big thing there. Of course, there's also the problem that because of Hydralisks and other issues with ZVP, a lot of players are saying, well, carriers are the only way you can win right now. I'm not sure if that's true, but what I do know for sure is that the carriers aren't really an interesting way to win games. You kind of just turtle, usually up into carriers. There are other ways to play, but most people are just kind of turtling up to these carriers, and they're either just getting killed by an attack right before they hit the critical mass, or they get the critical mass and then they very slowly choke their opponent out by not taking a really bad engagement. So I think carriers right now are kind of, I don't know, they're kind of in a weird spot. I honestly just think Snoot's suggestions there are perfect. Let the carrier come out a little bit, you know, a little bit more powerful, but cut off its overall strength just a little bit. And at least that way, you're still letting people experiment with the carrier and figure out how it goes. But you've got some fantastic suggestions in there. All right, guys, so siege tanks. Let's talk about tanks. All right, tanks are powerful. They do more damage. I don't have a lot of thoughts on tanks. I think we need more time to figure out if they're actually good or not. What we can say for sure is that even though they don't seem to do much damage versus light units when they're spread out, the moment Zerglings or Marines clump up, it is disgusting how much damage they do. So anyone who's like, oh, it only does 40 damage to light, trust me, wait until some units clump up in front of your tanks. It's still pretty amazing. You can't have splash damage being too overpowered in StarCraft 2 simply because the units clump up too much. So that's something which I think Blizzard are being quite careful with, and that's actually a good choice. The problem right now is Mech in general, so it's not just siege tanks, but it's Mech in general. Is it viable? No. Not at the highest levels. You can make it work right up to GM for sure, but against Zerg, Vipers is still a massive issue. You've now given 1 extra range to Hydralisks. I used to always say to people, how do you fight Mech? Roach Hydra Viper, just rush to Vipers. Once Vipers are out, you can just abduct Mech units over and over. If they're too clumped up to defend against the abduct, you just blinding cloud everything and go. There's a lot of discussion about that right now. Should the Viper be nerfed? Is the tank strong enough? All this sort of stuff. I think right now, I don't really know, because without the Viper, Zerg really will struggle against Mech. It comes back to the way the economy works in StarCraft 2. You can't really just out-economy your opponent. You can't just be like, I've got 7 bases, therefore I've got double your economy, because you won't have any supply left. Because each base benefits from too many workers. This is something we talked about before Legacy of the Void came out. It's not going to get revisited. We know that, so there's no point in talking about it. But right now, Mech, making it viable, I have no idea how you're going to do that without making the Viper a shit unit or doing something else completely different. And it's going to be really tough. What Blizzard actually said is Viper strength versus Mech play. We'd like to discuss nerfing the duration of Blinding Cloud versus reducing the range of Abduct. I think either of those upgrades might be okay. I know Snoot on this was saying that basically it won't change the fact that, basically Zerg can still just kind of roll over the top of an army, just spamming out their spells. Just because an extra 1 range goes down on the abduct won't change that Zerg can just dive in and abduct all the units, or dive in and blinding cloud all the units. It doesn't matter if the blinding cloud only lasts a few seconds, it's still going to wreck the Mech army pretty hard. So let's read what Snoot's thoughts are. He said, simply nerfing the Viper abilities won't solve the identity crisis of the Viper. The unit by design is created to be in one of those modes, and consume encourages the hit and run over time play, which is what you're meant to use as the Viper. If you remove that, you force straight up fights, and thus possibly a stale board state of the matchup until the point of combat. So he's saying, if you don't have Vipers having that ability to constantly poke in and out, constantly coming in from multiple angles, then you know, basically Zerg's just going to sit there and make Broodlord, Corruptor, Infestor, Viper and just like wait for an engagement. And he says also, I have no doubt that Mass Raven will actually destroy Sky Zerg, and that Mass Viper, Hydra Swarm Host, killing them before they get there and taking free trades is a better way of making it work at the moment. I do think Terran late game is stronger than Zerg, but it's impossible for them to reach that stage, so one should work on fixing both. So basically what Snoot's saying there is, at the moment, at least there's a back and forth. At least there's action. Yes, it's kind of impossible for Terran to hit that ultimate late game, but at least it's in this state where the Zerg is coming in and taking trades. He says, rather than just saying, well, let's just nerf the Zerg's ability to do that, why not increase the Zerg's ability to come in and take trades and pick off units, but also increase the Terran's ability to get to that ultra late game stage? Maybe making Ravens more accessible somehow, making you know, that eventual Sky transition a bit more accessible. Is that really something which we want to do? For me personally, I think it's so complicated making Mech work. Like once you go to these late game stages of the game, everything gets crazy. There's so many different possibilities. And this is something where I'm very open-ended. I don't have a clear fucking message on this, guys. I'm just like, oh man, making Mech work is hard. Scratch his head and moves on. That's it. I've got so little actual insight to give on that other than, I'm happy I don't have your job, guys at Blizzard. Mech's hard. I know there's a lot of people in the community who actually are like, we don't want Mech. Mech's always going to be slow and boring. Like, it doesn't work. And part of my brain says the same thing simply due to the way the legacy of the Void economy works. What I find at the moment, and what Mech has really been like for the past, well, ever since HOTS came out and the Viper came out, it was all about Terran, when they wanted to play Mech, putting on sick harassment and then smoothly transitioning into Mech while keeping up the aggression with lots of things like Hellion run-bys and Banshee run-bys and all this sort of stuff. And because the Mech harassment openings were much more flexible than Bio, because your factories and your starports obviously, you know, transitioned into Mech, delaying things like Stim doesn't matter. Whereas with Bio play, that would really handicap you, you know. Because of that, I felt like Mech play had really cool, aggressive kind of harassment options and ways of putting the pressure on Zerg. And it was all about carrying that momentum through to the later stages. So in that current state, it still kind of plays that same way, where Mech is all about your early game. Can you put enough damage on the Zerg? Can you harass well enough? What about Mech against Protoss? It doesn't work. Immortals are too good. I tried it a bunch. I asked a few other people. Until someone shows me differently, Mech just doesn't work against Protoss, guys. The Cyclone is not good enough as a general unit, because it just gets wrecked by things like Adepts and Chargelets. It just doesn't kill them. It takes too long to kill anything, and then they're on top of you. So you end up in this position as Terran where you're like, I need enough Hellbats to clear up Chargelots and Adepts. I need enough tanks to clear up, you know, to be the meat of the army. And then suddenly your opponent just goes like pure Blink Stalker Immortal, and they just like blink on your siege tanks, and your Hellbat's like running around like, hey, I'm doing 12 damage, oh, cool. And, you know, all your tanks are gone and you kind of lose the game. Basically, Protoss, with the power of the Warp Prism as well being able to be aggressive, it just seems like it's impossible for Mech to work against Protoss. If anyone has pro games where it's working or anything like that, shoot me your replays, please. I would love to see it. But right now, Mech against Protoss seems to have been a failed cause. It just doesn't seem to work with the way the game is designed. So guys, let's get towards the end of the show now. Let's start to close things up in the near future. What is coming next is a couple of these Zerg buffs. The Swarm Host. It's too cheap. Right now, it's a specialty unit. We don't see it in a lot of pro games, so this is more of a prediction than me talking about the Swarm Host. Literally, all I'm saying as analysis is the Swarm Host is too cheap and too good. I think it's going to influence map design way too much, because if you've got exposed bases where Swarm Hosts can just run up and throw Locusts in, it's like, oh, this map's too powerful for Swarm Hosts. But my prediction is that the Swarm Host will not get nerfed for quite a long time. And the reason for that is the Swarm Host is a specialty unit. It's a harassment unit. It's not a unit where you run in the front and just kill your opponent. The Swarm Host is a unit which it's kind of like a spellcaster in that it gains value over time. So you're never going to see someone just instantly win a game the moment they get Swarm Hosts. Whereas, say, someone hits a Cyclone timing that's overpowered. they just kill you with the Cyclone attack. And it's over. And everyone goes, oh, Cyclones are broken. With Swarm Host, it takes a little bit longer to happen. It's also more complicated in terms of how you execute it. So Swarm Hosts are going to take a long time for people to start using a lot. But in a few months, every pro gamer will be using Swarm Hosts a lot of the time. And the only time that will stop is when the meta shifts so that Protoss and Terran players are specifically trying to constantly get out on the map and stop Swarm Hosts get anywhere near their base. The only way they can defend Swarm Hosts is by getting out either air units, so Banshees, Void Rays, Phoenix, Oracles, to constantly zone where the Swarm Hosts can come from, or to have their army out in the middle of the map looking for where those Swarm Hosts are coming from, forcing the Locusts out early and then just pulling back so that the Swarm Hosts can't get those Locusts into their mineral lines and into the production. The reason this is going to be so powerful for Zerg is because if you're forcing a Terran or Protoss onto the map, you're forcing them away from that turtle mode based gameplay. And as a result, Zerg can then use mid-game armies. So small numbers of Swarm Hosts in order to force a Terran or Protoss onto the map, force them out there if they're not using air units to zone, and then using these big mid-game sort of armies to get surrounds on these armies on the map, or while the army is out of position by the Locusts to hit the third base or the fourth base. These sort of styles for Zerg are going to get very popular. That's my prediction. And I think it will get nerfed, but I think it might take too long to get nerfed. So this is something I really want to keep an eye on. And in a few months when pros start using Swarm Hosts a lot, I'm very curious to see how quickly Blizzard reacts to that, because I'm pretty convinced the Swarm Host's too powerful at its current cost. Beyond that, the Baneling buff is something which we've seen the Baneling get 10 extra hit points when Baneling speed kicks in. So many Zerg buffs, right? Seems kind of crazy. Luckily, the Swarm Host is kind of a niche unit. The Baneling here with its 10 hit point buff, it's made a small yet sizable increase in the effectiveness of Ling Bane against Bio. It's made Banelings mixed in with Hydras or Ravager Zergling against Protoss also more effectively. But it's so hard to weigh up. This is one of these small incremental changes where it's like, this unit is a bit stronger, but it's still a suicide unit. It's only 10 hit points. It's a big percentage of its hit points. How much does this really change? Oh, I don't know, man. This is one of these things where anyone who's jumping to an assumption on the Baneling buff, like I immediately was saying, I think this is probably too strong versus Bio, and that's still my feeling, but I need to actually see this played out, especially with the Bio tank being the new style in Zerg versus Terran. Is it actually too powerful against this? Only time will tell, so that's one which I'm going to leave any kind of hard prediction off for now and say, yeah, I'm fine with Blizzard just letting this one play out for a bit longer. There's so many other crazy changes that it's so hard to actually judge whether this is good or not. Maybe that could lead us to questioning Blizzard on like, was this a good idea, putting in this like fundamental buff on what is really a core unit at the same time as doing the other stuff? I don't know, maybe it's a bit risky doing that. Anyway, they chose to do it. We'll see where it goes. For the next one, Infestor. All right, guys, the Infestor is just ridiculous. This is such a silly change. I'm gonna be very hard here and just say let's watch some clips. Check it. Oh! All right, that was disgusting. And no, another one. Cool. Oh my god, that's so disgusting. Oh my god. At least they don't have collision size. So yeah. Okay, so keep in mind, guys. Obviously, these were ideal scenarios. These are like very cherry-picked examples. The problem with Infestor being able to cast Burrow isn't necessarily the fact that it can cast Burrow on its own in isolation. The problem is the fact that Terran doesn't have detection. Terran doesn't have mobile detection. Their detection is tied to their economy. This is not the same as StarCraft 1, where that energy is literally just for scouting. No, this is your mule energy. And this is a fundamental problem with how Terran detection has been designed in StarCraft 2, and it is a limiting factor on why you need to be very careful about giving unlimited burrow or invisibility to any fucking unit that Terran has to play against, because they've got missile turrets, which they can't bring with their army, unless you want Terran to play that style, which we do not want Terran to play a viable style where they have to build missile turrets wherever they move. It goes against the entire idea of the game. The real problem here is that you just don't have a Raven as a core unit, and making the auto turret is stronger is fantastic. If you guys didn't see, I did an episode last week on how like Nathanius and a few other guys are just opening Raven harass every game. It's actually, I think, the strongest opening in TVT right now. In my opinion, is just opening up like a safety Raven, because it can just wreck any sort of siege tank pressure or any sort of Viking harassment or anything like that. But the problem is the Raven is still an exceptionally expensive unit, and you need a starport on a tech lab. And that's where the real problem is for Terran. You simply cannot put a starport on a tech lab at the start of the game without just totally messing up your build and making it awkward as all shit. It slows down everything else. It slows down your stim and everything like that. It's not just the 200 gas for the Raven, it's everything else as well. And if Terran gets kind of pushed into, I need to open up with a Raven every game, it just limits the range of builds which Terran has, and it allows their opponents to kind of blind counter and just basically assume what's coming their way and play extra greedy because they know what's going to be happening. So the Raven is just not the answer to this sort of play. You're not going to see Terran constantly just having a Raven there for detection, unless that becomes like a core style. So I definitely think this is too strong against Terran right now. It's way too punishing on anyone who just lets their army clump up. And trust me, guys, it's not just random people on ladder. Pro gamers let their army clump up, and this sort of shit will happen to pros as well. When they think there's no Zerg nearby or their Zerg doesn't have vision, bam, fungal from underground, and it's going to be a bit too powerful. I think this is too powerful. What can you do to make the Infestor more viable instead? Shit, I don't know, man, but I feel like this is just way too strong. I also feel like this is another reason why, if the Terran doesn't have tanks, Infestor Hydra is just like ridiculous. Like, what are you going to do against that? Hydra's already outranged all your units, and now fungal can lock them down as well. Like, fortunately, that's not a composition which hits early in the game. It's very gas heavy. You know, it's very much a theoretical composition. But the real problem is just the fact that you've got these like burrowed map hack dudes that can also just completely wreck your army if it ever clumps up. I think this is just way too powerful. How do you make the Infestor, you know, more viable? I don't know, man. It was already getting used, not a crazy amount, but it was getting used with things like Ravages when it was paired with the right situation, units like Ultras. I don't think the Infestor needs this buff. I think it's just a little bit too much. So yeah, that's my thoughts on the Infestor. Just too powerful. Ravens just aren't accessible enough for Terran. So I think already burrowed Banelings, when the Zerg has enough APM to burrow them everywhere, is already a big enough problem for Terran. I don't think having burrowed Infestors is something which is fair at all. So guys, I already talked about everything else. Last note, Zealot Legs is awesome. It's cool to see Zealots a little bit more mobile on the map. They can outrun Ravages off creep and all this sort of stuff. They're really mobile. Does make them a bit more powerful against Terran. Is that going to be worrying or not? I think Bio will still be perfectly fine against Charge Lots, but we'll see exactly how it plays out over the coming weeks. But anyway, guys, thank you so much for hanging out and watching. The Raven has been buffed as well. Let me just look back at the community feedback, because I wasn't really basing this show off the community feedback, but I should take a look at it. Is there anything I didn't talk about? Oh yeah, so basically, I think the Hydra is really strong. I think the Colossus change is like, it's okay, but I think if the Hydra stays in its current state, then Colossus becomes the necessary answer, and I don't like that. As I mentioned, I think the Hydralisk instead should not have that extra range buff, because it just makes the army scale in terms of damage way too hard and yet still be just as fragile. So I think make Hydralisks a little bit tankier, leave Colossus the way they are, but let Storm, Disruptors, Stalkers, and those units actually zone out those Hydras. You're going to end up in a much better balanced position where there's back and forth engagements, rather than I've got a concave of Hydras, you can engage me, and either you break the concave and all the Hydras just disappear, or the Hydras just kill literally everything before you even get into contact with them, because they do such insane damage. I think it's just a little bit too one-sided right now. So we really want to promote in StarCraft as much back and forth combat as possible. I want to see some of these suggestions get put in. I think Snoot's suggestions with the carrier are something which should just be thrown into the game immediately, because it isn't even a nerf. It's just changing up the way the carrier works, making it pop out a bit stronger, but make it a little bit weaker later on and kind of in mass numbers. You give it the upgrade straight away, you give it interceptors straight away, but slow down its then ability to just become this like, oh, here's a ball of carriers, you can't do anything about it. I think these sort of changes, which are going to try and create back and forth engagements, create armies which scale a little bit more evenly, should create more fun play. I think so far, in summary, This is a really fun patch. There's crazy changes. I'm loving running around fungling and neuraling people from underground. I'm looking forward to the Cyclone getting its range back and trying it out and trying to mix it in my compositions a bit more. But like I said, I do feel like maybe the Cyclone just needs more damage against light, less damage against armored, make it more of a well-rounded unit, and we might see that it'll actually find its place. I really think that this Cyclone, one last finishing point, if you've got a unit which costs 100 gas, and you're comparing it to, oh, we don't want it to overlap with the role of the Hellion. Guess what? The Hellion only costs minerals, and it's faster and more harassment oriented, and it can kill workers. It's already got its own roles. It doesn't matter if they're both really good against light units. One costs a shitload of gas, one only costs minerals. They're still going to have very different identities. So I really think make that Cyclone stronger versus light units. Who cares about overlapping units? Just give the Cyclone a role which people actually care about. And also don't listen to people complaining about it not being micro-oriented. I'm sorry to all you guys who want every single Terran unit to be micro-oriented. It's not happening. It's just not cool. Right now, Terran has to micro too much shit. If they just get an A-move unit thrown in the mech arsenal, it is fine. Let them have one A-move unit. Just let them have it. Don't complain about it. Let it be a derpy unit that just runs around and shoots rockets out of its head like a drunk fucking rocket launcher thing. I don't know what the fuck the thing is. It's shooting these like tiny missiles. Let it do it. Let it have fun. As long as Terran gets an A-move unit, which they can throw in there and they don't need to constantly stare at in order to get value out of. So anyway, guys, that's all done for today. Thank you so much for hanging out. Don't forget to hug a watermelon, kick a walrus, and of course, punch a watermelon to the moon. I'll catch you guys next time. Goodbye and good night. And before I go, one last thing. We're going to be hitting up Snoot and Showtime this week, and they're going to be analyzing BlizzCon games. So I'm pretty sure tomorrow I'm going to be doing the show with Showtime. I might push back to the day after that if he's free. We'll see. I've still got to confirm with some of the players. But definitely tune into the shows this week because we're going to have a bunch of pro players going over their BlizzCon games with me. And I'll probably throw up some threads on Reddit where you guys can ask questions to the players as well. So I'll see you guys tomorrow. Catch you later.